All right, if you're prepping for the UPSC, you know the Revolt of 1857 is a huge topic. But here's the thing. Just knowing what happened isn't enough. The real marks, the real understanding, comes from digging into why it ultimately failed. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to perform a little autopsy on this massive event, piece by piece. Let's get into it.
So this is the big question, right? You had this massive, earth-shaking event. I mean, the Revolt of 1857 absolutely terrified the British Empire. It had all the ingredients you'd think, so much courage, so much passion, and in some places, huge numbers of people rising up. So what happened? What was the missing piece? Why did it fizzle out? That's the puzzle we're putting together today.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to tackle this in a few parts. First, we'll talk about how this wasn't really a single united uprising. Then, we'll get into the gear, the massive tech difference. Think swords versus rifles. After that, we'll look at the leadership, or maybe the lack of a central plan. Then, we'll explore why everyone was fighting for different reasons. And to wrap it all up, we'll see what lessons came out of the whole thing.
Okay, first up, let's bust a common myth. We often hear about this as a huge nationwide rebellion, but that's not quite the full picture. The truth is, while the revolt was incredibly fierce where it happened, it was far from an all-India event. And right there, that limited reach, well, that was a major problem from the get-go.
I mean, look at this, just 1/4. Let that number sink in for a second. Only about a quarter of the entire country's land area was actually caught up in the revolt. That's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah, so a whopping 75% of the country was pretty much quiet. We're talking the entire East, the entire South, and even big chunks of the West just didn't join in. And you can see how this was a huge advantage for the British, right? They didn't have to spread their army thin across the whole subcontinent. They could just focus all their firepower on the areas where the trouble was.
And it's not just about the land, it's about the people on it. Some historians figured that less than 10% of the population actually participated. That means more than 90% of people were essentially spectators, just watching from the sidelines. The vast majority of people were not involved at all.
So who were these people on the sidelines? Well, it turns out they were some pretty important groups. You had the educated Indians, the growing middle class. You had a lot of really powerful rulers. Think of the Scindias in Gwalior or the Holkars in Indore, who actually sided with the British or stayed out of it. Add to that the big zamindars, the merchants, the moneylenders, all of whom decided this wasn't their fight.
And this really gets to the heart of why, especially for the educated class, they didn't see this as a modern fight for a new India. To them, it looked like a step backwards, an attempt to bring back old kings and feudal ways. They were kind of betting on the British to bring in modernization, reforms and progress. And because of that belief, this really smart, influential part of society just sat out. A huge blow to the rebellion.
Okay, on to our next point. So you've got this fractured uprising, and on top of that, you have a massive gap in technology. It really was a case of bringing a sword to a gunfight. The rebels were using old-school tools against an army that had the full might of the Industrial Revolution behind it.
I mean, just look at the difference here. On one side, you have the rebels fighting with old muskets, swords, spears, whatever they could get their hands on. And on the other side, you have the British soldiers with the brand new Enfield rifle. It was more accurate, had a longer range. It was just a completely different league. In a head-to-head battle, the firepower was just no contest.
And hey, technology isn't just about what goes bang. The British had a secret weapon that was maybe even more powerful, the electric telegraph. This thing was an absolute game changer. Imagine their commander-in-chief able to send messages almost instantly, coordinating his troops, getting real-time updates. The rebels had, well, they had messengers on horseback. The British were always one step ahead because they could communicate so much faster.
Which brings us to our third big reason, leadership. And this one's a bit tricky. There's no question that the revolt was filled with incredibly brave people. But all that personal courage, it just wasn't backed up by a solid, coordinated plan. There was no central command, no one person calling the shots for the entire rebellion.
You know the names, of course. Nana Sahib, Tatya Tope, Kunwar Singh, Rani Lakshmi Bai, absolute legends. Their bravery is off the charts. But the key thing to remember is that they were leading their own fights in their own regions. They were brilliant local commanders, but they weren't working together as part of one big unified army with a single grand strategy.
So at the end of the day, you had these courageous but separate rebel leaders going up against seasoned British generals who were experts in large-scale warfare. They knew how to manage supply lines, coordinate different regiments, and plan campaigns.
all the heroism in the world couldn't make up for that massive gap in strategic experience.
All right, point number 4, and this might be the most important one of all. What was everyone actually fighting for? You see, for a revolution to really work, everyone needs to be on the same page, fighting for the same big idea. And in 1857, that just wasn't the case.
This really breaks it down perfectly. You have Rani Lakshmibai, she's fighting for her kingdom, for Jhansi. You have the sepoys, who are furious about their pay and the infamous cartridges. You've got some folks who want to put the Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, back on the throne. Then you have someone like Kur Singh, who just wants his land back. See the pattern? Everyone had their own personal reason, their own local fight. There was no single, unifying why.
And this was a fatal weakness. There was no shared idea of what an independent India would even look like. For the British, this was a golden opportunity. It let them use their classic divide and rule tactic. They could pick off each group one by one, either by crushing them or making a deal, because they never had to face one massive, ideologically united opponent.
Okay, so let's zoom out and put all these pieces together. Because understanding why this revolt failed is, in many ways, even more important than just knowing the story. The failure itself became a kind of roadmap for what not to do, and it taught some incredibly valuable lessons for the future. So here's a quick recap of our anatomy of failure. You've got 4 main pillars. Number 1, limited participation. Not everyone was in on it. Number 2, the tech gap. They were seriously outgunned. Number 3, poor organization. No central leader, no big plan. And number 4, no unified vision. Everyone was fighting their own battle.
And here's the really crucial takeaway, the thing you absolutely need to remember. None of these problems existed in a vacuum. They were all connected, feeding into each other. The lack of a shared goal made it impossible to get organized. The limited number of people involved meant they could never hope to close that technology gap. It wasn't just one thing that went wrong, it was a total system failure.
And that brings us to the final and maybe most important thought. The people who came later, the leaders of India's actual freedom struggle, they studied 1857 very, very carefully. So the question to leave you with is this: how did they learn from all these mistakes? How did they manage to build a movement that was pan-Indian, that did have a unified goal, and that was highly organized? Thinking about that, well, that's where you see the true legacy of 1857's failure.